Thank you very much. It's truly an absolute delight to be here tonight. I'm not going to stand behind the podium. I'm a bit of a wanderer when it comes to speaking on stage. It's hard to stick behind something, but I've promised I'll stay close to the microphone here. Where to start? A little bit maybe about me. I think I realised very early on in life that something was wrong with the state of the world. I had a father who, during the war, he was Irish, he came from County Down. He had been a climatologist. And so the conversation around climate change back in the 80s was something that was quite prevalent in my life. And he had big vision, actually, I realise now. He died 15, maybe 18 years ago. But he brought a different way of engaging with the world to, a young girl. And we were living out in the countryside in the west, northwest of Glasgow. And so touching into nature was very, very important to me. And I think I had a strong vein of injustice in me, or a sense of injustice, from a very young age. I didn't actually get on very well with my father when I was that age. I spent a lot of time saying, it's not fair. But it was only later that I really began to appreciate him so fully, and the skills and the values that I inherited from him, and his deep, deep care and love for the earth. And it's been something that I can look back in my life and I see that thread growing stronger and stronger and stronger, until actually it got to a point when I was in court one day. It was a case that had been going on for 3 years, and I was in the Court of Appeal in the Royal Courts of Justice in London, and I found myself looking out of the window and thinking, it's not just my client who's been badly injured and harmed here, so has the earth. And the next thought did actually change my life. I found myself thinking, the earth is in need of a good lawyer. And in a way, I see now that, we're given these moments in time of life where we're given an opportunity or a challenge. It's a junction point. Where do we go? Do we follow the thought, or do we continue on with our own business as usual? For me, I found myself going back to this idea, the earth is in need of a good lawyer. What could that mean? We have a whole bank of environmental law. Why would it need someone, like me to step into that space? And is that really what I'm being called upon to do? And I found myself realizing very quickly that the existing laws that we had didn't work. You just have to look at the Amazon to know that. The Athabasca tar sands in Canada, a very good example of mass damage and destruction. What was going on here? How is it that we have created laws to govern society that we kind of collectively buy into? So we accept that theft of an apple is wrong, of course. But here, mass damage and destruction of the earth is perfectly lawful. It doesn't exist as a crime yet. How is it that we got into that place where we'd allowed that to start playing out in such a huge scale, an enormous scale, that somehow it's easy enough to create crimes at the bottom end, but here when it comes to the very top end, the really big stuff, there's actually surprisingly little that's been identified as a crime. To cut a long story short, what I ended up doing was I ended up going down a rabbit hole of inquiry. I ended up investigating how can we create a legal duty of care. I asked myself a very powerful question. How can we create a legal duty of care? And I didn't know the answer to this, and I ended up looking around trying to find the lawyers that were out there doing it. And actually I couldn't find anyone. And I sort of went round and came back to me and went, maybe it's up to me to work this out, because I can't find anyone who is. And, it's a funny thing, in schools we're taught to give answers. We celebrate everyone who has the answers. You get really good grades if you know all the answers. But actually, we're not really taught how to ask questions, especially the big questions that we don't know the answers to. And I think it's very powerful when we do ask big questions that we don't know the answer to. And often what happens is that we discover, in fact, the answer lies within ourselves. If you give enough space for something to emerge up and through, it actually does happen. So I found myself in Copenhagen at the climate negotiations in 2009, when someone in the audience stood up and said, we need a new language to deal with this mass damage and destruction. And it was like a light bulb, really a light bulb above my head, thinking, it's like genocide, only it's ecocide. Wow, that should be a crime. How come that's not a crime? And I literally ran back home and went down that rabbit hole of inquiry right again. And went back to first principles, good lawyer goes back to first principles. Discovered, what do we already have in place as international crime? What's already there? Is it possible? Could this be created as another international crime? And if so, how could that be done? And actually, what exactly would that be? How do we give legal definition to it? So I spent 3 months obsessed with how this could work, and hardly slept during this time, just working it out and spending time working it out and reading up some of the foremost jurists of their time. Hans Keller is one of them, who wrote about the emergence of the United Nations and international crimes against peace. I went back, there's huge documentation, big thick tome of it, that I dug into. I dug out obscure documents, I looked to see what we already had, and I came up after 3 months realizing that not only could we do this, but we could do this actually quite fast. All it needs is an amendment to an existing document, the Rome Statute, which is possibly the most important international legal document we have. It governs, it codifies the existing international crimes against peace. We have genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The fourth one, crimes of aggression, that was just signed off, so to say, back in 2010. That's the run-up to war. And for me, there was a missing fifth crime, the crime of ecocide. To criminalise extensive damage, destruction to or loss of ecosystems. And my definition encompassed both ascertainable human-caused ecocide, which is largely but not entirely corporate ecocide, so mass damage and destruction through corporate activity, but also it's about creating a legal duty of care to give assistance for naturally occurring ecocide. So rising sea levels, tsunamis, anything that leads to catastrophic ecosystem collapse. At the moment, there is no duty of care. In climate negotiations, which I was involved in for 3 years, what I saw there was, in fact, the Maldives saying, help us, we're going underwater. I don't know if any of you saw that fantastic bit of footage where they held a parliamentary meeting underwater that went out around the world to demonstrate how impossible it would be to govern from beneath the water. But in climate negotiation terms, when they stand up and say, help us, everyone says, we don't want to know. It's a kind of almost a blindness, a willful blindness, if you like. I don't want to look there, it's too big. It's too big to take on. 54 small island states are at risk of going underwater within 7 to 15 years. And not just small island states, we're looking at Bangladesh, Iceland, melting of ice caps there. Ice caps keep the volcanic activity at bay. What happens when that goes? So many, many countries are adversely impacted by naturally occurring ecocide. Whether or not you name it climate change, actually doesn't matter in legal terms. What matters is whether or not you're looking at significant harm, mass damage and destruction, or loss of ecosystems, and how we can create a legal duty of care for governments to come together and give assistance in advance, not after the event, because then it's a little bit too late. When we're looking at mass environmental refugee issues here, relocation, what happens then? We don't just put people on boats and leave them to it. This is not a good solution. That's not going to work. So for me, this is also about creating a law for life. It's a life-affirming law. It's about recognizing our right to life as human beings, but also the Earth's right to life, future generations' right to life. And most importantly, this is about the life of all beings. So how does that work? You know, this seems like a huge idea. And in fact, when I first started talking about this to my lawyer friends, many of them would say, Polly, you're mad. The Earth doesn't have the right to life. But what if it does? We just haven't written it down in law. And what I did was I ended up looking around to see who was it that was out there that really got my way of thinking. Because obviously my legal friends didn't at that time. They do now. And I found myself looking to the indigenous world. And what I discovered was, in fact, there are 370 million, in UN terms, indigenous people in the world who really get this. In fact, for them it's a kind of, yes, and, moment. They understand that the Earth has the right to life. And Buddhists, 380 million Buddhists, yeah, of course, this makes sense to them, they understand this. Wow, that's 750 million, that's the size of Europe who gets the way I'm thinking. Maybe this isn't such a mad idea. Maybe giving the Earth's right to life affirmation in law is about us in the Western world playing catch up with something that's a kind of greater wisdom here at play. But to ground this in legislation, this is about creating governance. So, for instance, our human right to life is protected and governed by the crime of murder. If it's myself and all of us here that are killed, then we're looking at genocide. And that creates the criminal responsibility. So just as I have my right to life, there is a duty and responsibility on all of us to respect the other person's life and not take it away. And if we do, there are consequences that play out in a criminal court of law. So for me, the understanding that the governance to protect the Earth's right to life is very simply by creating an international crime of ecocide seemed to make really good sense. Criminalising mass damage and destruction also affords the Earth's right to life. So it's a life-affirming law. What happened next was really quite surprising. Very soon after I proposed this into the United Nations, it took off in a huge way. It seemed to touch a chord right across the world. Very quickly, I was interviewed by The Guardian, and they said, Polly, you know, we need a website. So a website went up literally the next day, and it triggered responses from all over the world. The website itself had huge 28,000 hits that weekend, and it really resonated with many people on many different continents. And in fact, I hadn't appreciated that the word ecocide had been around for a very long time. In South America, when I turned out there for climate negotiations in Cancun, ecocidio was a word that was very well understood. A lot of individuals were there to complain about the ecocidio that was happening in their land, and the idea of criminalising it was very alive to them and to Latin America as a whole. But what was very interesting was that a journalist got in touch with me and said, what do I make of the fact that the law of ecocide very nearly became an international crime in the mid-90s. Now, I knew nothing about this. This hadn't come up in my research at all. And he had a UN document. All UN documents are code reference numbered. And it referenced the fact that ecocide hadn't proceeded at a certain stage. Now, this document was my gold dust. This was fantastic news to me. Could it have been that there is some kind of traction here, that it had a past history that could maybe help me even more? And what happened was, University of London stepped in and said, hey Polly, we could go and research this for you. I knew I needed to find someone that could go into the UN basement and pull out documents. Dr. Damien Short and his team of students went down, they did just that. I needed someone who actually knew their way around those documents, and he'd been researching a very interesting individual whose work I'm very engaged in, Raphael Lemkin, who's the lawyer who really got out in his soapbox, kind of like what I'm doing, advancing the crime of genocide, and how he took that forward, and within a matter of just 12 years that became an international crime. So, things can move very fast sometimes when there's a point in time in history when it's right. Change can happen very quickly. And Damien and his team went down and they pulled out documents, and what we discovered, it wasn't just one document, it was 2 lever arch files, and that was just what they managed to unearth in 2 weeks. Going all the way back to 1972, the Stockholm Conference, the first ever international conference on the environment, which was opened with a call for ecocide. We're talking about the time of Vietnam. And in fact, 7,000 people had marched out in the streets during that time. A working group was put together on crimes against the environment, and a draft ecocide convention was drafted up and presented the following year in the UN. So things had been happening earlier on. In fact, just recently I've discovered it went back through Raphael Lemkin to the 1940s. Genocide, it was discussed whether or not to have provisions of ecocide in the genocide legislation. And cultural genocide as well, alongside ecocide. I have cultural ecocide embedded in the draft legislation for ecocide. So we don't just have ecological ecocide, the mass damage and destruction of the earth there, but in fact taking communities away from their land is a form of cultural ecocide in its own right. And I've seen that, I've directly experienced that in the Northern Territories in Australia, where some of you will, I'm sure, have heard of the intervention, where 4 years ago the government went in under the pretext of child abuse within the Indigenous communities, took in the army to take away the children from those communities and impounded those Indigenous communities, withdrew their ability to use money and withdrew their right to the land and suspended the relevant provisions of the Race Discrimination Act so that no action could be taken against that decision. Now, not one case was ever brought to say that there was ever child sex abuse. No evidence has ever been brought to bear. Meanwhile, their land has been handed over under contracts, governmental contracts, to companies to go in and mine. This is not just an ecological ecocide, it's a cultural ecocide. And communities implode very, very fast, of course. Sadly, this is a sorry tale that I know and have had experience in discussing with many Indigenous communities around the world. Where does it stop? When do we get to a point and we say, enough, no more? This must stop. Well, we've done it before in history, and we can do it again. We did it with the abolition of slavery. We did it with genocide. We did it with apartheid. And I say now that we can do this with ecocide. And we do draw that line in the sand and we say, no, that is enough now. We criminalise that. And what we do is we shift norms. We shift that sense of it being just the way things are, that mass damage and destruction plays out across the world. And we say, no more. And if you choose to go down that route, then there are consequences that are to be addressed in a criminal court of law. This is very powerful. And in fact, when I was researching my first book, Eradicating Ecocide, and I was looking at the abolition of slavery, because really that was a time in history where we had a huge shift in consciousness happening and playing out there, where, when William Wilberforce stood up and said, this doesn't work, commoditizing humanity by dint of their colour, to bind, to sell, to use and abuse, it doesn't work. People said to him, you're mad. You can't outlaw that. It's not a crime. But what was so interesting about William Wilberforce was, and not just William Wilberforce, of course, many, many others who stood up and spoke out. The Quakers were really the drivers, the initial drivers and all of this, but many, many people spoke out. Basket weavers of Liverpool, dockers of Bristol. It came from so many different directions. Josiah Wedgwood made teapots with blacks in chains saying, I am a human being. He used his teapots as a way of messaging that you supported the abolition of slavery. Very powerful. And what was so amazing there was that when William Wilberforce and many others stood up and spoke out, it was about giving voice, creating a visibility, and saying, this must end. William Wilberforce understood three things had to happen. There had to be the pooling of subsidies. Slavery was very heavily subsidised, as is, interestingly, fossil fuel, for instance, today. New laws have to be created. So this is about outlawing, literally outlawing, criminalising slavery. Because that's the physical manifestation of the intent. That's the power of legislation, written legislation. But the third thing, creating the enabling conditions and giving the support to those companies so that they don't collapse, but they go on to create the innovation in the other direction. Now that to me was hugely informative to learn this about William Wilberforce. He had meetings with one of the most amazing men of his time, who really has become a kind of, footnote in the annals of history, Charles Grant. Charles Grant was one of the biggest directors. He headed up the British East India Company. And he and William Wilberforce would meet in secret in a house in London that is now owned by one of our climate scientists. I've been in it, wonderful house and hidden rooms. And they would have secret meetings to talk about this, because here, one of the biggest bastions of industry of his time, if not the biggest, really got the fact that slavery must stop. Something remarkable happened there, because Charles Grant did stand up and speak out, and he said, enough, this must end. And this was a man who stood to lose so much. He stood to lose his status, his career, his money. He was at risk of his company going down the tubes very fast. That was a company that made a lot of money, not just directly, but indirectly out of the slave trade, facilitation of slaves being one, but also sugar. The first monocropping of plantations was entirely dependent on slaves. So this was a man who stood up and he spoke out, and he spoke out very, very powerfully. And when he did that, what he did was he gave permission to others to stand up and do the same. And this is what sometimes happens. In fact, it's not sometimes, it always does happen. Each and every one of us, when we stand up and we speak out for a greater injustice, it really gets us out of our comfort zone sometimes. That moment when it seems like the tide is all going this way, to turn around and say, no, I choose to go another way. It is that moment when we really can step out of our comfort zone or to the very edges, when we say, enough, no more, and we fear that we'll be ridiculed for doing this. The politician who actually stands up on a point of principle rather than just what will get votes. But that is greatness, that moment when that happens. You know, that moment to actually step out of the comfort zone and stand up and say, enough, this must end. This doesn't work. And when that happens, you give permission to others to stand up and do the same again and again and again. And in fact, that's what happened. Many people within industry were beginning to recognize that this must end, but they were too afraid to stand up and speak out. So it's about creating the enabling conditions so that others can speak out, whether or not that's politically or in business, academically, grassroots level. And to say, okay, we don't come to the table with clean hands on this, but maybe, just maybe, we could do something to change this around and show to the rest of the world that we can move forward in a very different direction. Now, what was so wonderful was that Wilberforce learned from Charles Grant how important it was not to let those companies collapse. Had they done that, we would have had economic collapse. A huge problem that we have today with the energy industry as well. What do? Get rid of them all? Of course not. This is about actually giving assistance so that the ship can turn around 180 degrees, so that the dirty energy companies can actually become the clean energy companies, so that the problem can become the solution. This is really about saying, okay, now that we have worked this out, now that we know this no longer works, let's work together to find the pathways forward to what does work, that is not determinative on creating significant harm, on creating mass damage and destruction, that does not cause ecocide. You know, before I went up to Copenhagen, I was given incredible wisdom. A friend of mine had met an indigenous leader down in Colombia, and he had said, only when we face the shadow self and give it a name can the healing begin. And this had kind of rattled around my head when I was up in Copenhagen. And I think it was no surprise when that individual in the audience said, you know, we need a new language for this mass damage and destruction. And I found myself thinking, yeah, it's ecocide. Because that really is facing the shadow self and giving it name. That really is turning around and saying, yeah, the Athabasca tar sands, that is an ecocide. The Amazon, mass destruction, an ecocide, without a doubt. When we get to the point where we're destroying the very last of our great peat bogs here in Northern Ireland, it begs the question, is that an ecocide? And what happens once it's gone, the last? It's too late, we don't get it back then. So this is about accountability at the very top end. This is about recognising that the principles known in international criminal law, superior responsibility. It's about recognition that those who are at, if you imagine like a triangle, who are at the very top, and it attaches itself to CEOs, directors, heads of state, ministers, heads of finance. This is about the flow of money as well. Those who are in a position to make a decision that can have huge adverse impact on many millions below, not just humans, of course. Because it's premised on a fundamental understanding of the interconnectedness of life. Destroy the very land that we walk on, and we destroy our ability to live in peaceful enjoyment. It's also based on, for me, the understanding of how sacred life is. The sacredness of the earth itself, the sacredness of how we engage with life. So finally, because I'm aware that my time is running short, I'd just like to say this one last thing. For me, this is a legacy issue. What we choose to do in our lives that can have huge ripples over time and space for future generations. What I've done is I've offered a pathway, a legal route between now and 2020 as to how this law can be fully operational. That's been taken into every single government of the world, and over the last year and a half, 2 years, I've now had 54 governments come forward asking for legal advice on this. whether or not it's at the UN level, ambassadors, ministers of state, or senior legal advisors. There are many people who are engaging on this around the world. How do we create the enabling conditions so that those individuals can stand up and speak out safely and say, enough, this must end. Now we can end this era of ecocide. And this is the law that can act as the driver to take us there. So this is our legacy, what we choose to do within our life to take this one big idea whose time has come forward. What is so amazing for me is that actually it had such energy behind it from the 1940s and then again in the mid-80s and mid-90s until at the last moment, after many countries had actually agreed that this needed to be made into an international crime. And there was the drafting of the Rome Statute. Many countries had stood up, had gone on record supporting it, but at the 11th hour it was announced it was being removed. No reasons were given. Countries actually stood up and objected. Amazingly, we now have the minutes of that meeting. Someone took minutes of the meeting. But it all happened behind closed doors. So I didn't know about it, you didn't know about it. But what is so amazing is that something that's pushed down over there, that working group on crimes against the environment, was closed down pretty much within a month of that meeting being held. Is that it popped up again over here in someone else's head in a completely different continent 15 years later. Just goes to show you can't keep a good idea down. But more than that, it shows that a lot of the legwork's been done. We don't need to go back and have huge discourse around this. All we need to do is amend an international document. And that's very powerful indeed. And creates an international crime that creates a mandatory provision that holds individuals accountable. This to me is not just a crime against humanity, a crime against nature, and a crime against future generations. Most importantly, this is a crime for peace. This is about us moving one step forward in understanding how we engage with life itself. And that with a law of ecocide, we can begin on that journey. Of that I'm sure. Thank you.